A quick stream while I wait for a student who I promised to help, but then I took too long with someone else, so that student has disappeared. And of course, between that last stream and this one, I deleted the worksheet, or I didn't save the worksheet that I had made, and I closed it and then looked at this next page of questions and realized maybe I should have kept that. All right, so let's start off by making sure that this is running. Looks like it's fine. Cool. If I share this, do I get the same thing? I get a different one. All right, I hear background noise. Kenny, are you there? All right, let me just quickly post this here. And another one. All right, so we've got that up almost. Cool. And then let's look at our question, which is another question about comparative and absolute advantage. So we got Gilberto and Juanita on a 20-acre plot of land, or each of them has 20 acres. And we've got this table showing how much they can produce per year per acre. So all these numbers we would multiply by 20. So let's start by thinking about what the PPF would look like, and then we'll think about these questions here. So on paper, let's see, this is, let me transform this so that it is correct. All right, so now when I move right, it moves right. Perfect. Nice, there we go. So we've got rye and we've got corn. And for Gilberto, if he spends all of his time on rye, out of 20 acres times 10 per acre is going to be 200, which we'll put right here. And if he spends all his time on corn, we're going to have 20 times 5. 20 times 10 would be 200, so 100 units of corn. For Juanita, she is 4 times as productive at rye. So if she spends 20 times 4 is going to be a bunch. Let's make this a little longer. It's going to be, what, 400. And if she uses all 20 acres to produce corn instead, then in a given year she would get, what is that, 160. This graph isn't going to be perfectly to scale, but it'll be enough to set us up. Now, if it was to scale, and to the extent this is to scale, this kind of looks like it's pointing up this way. So Gilberto, my first instinct, without thinking too hard about the numbers, is that Gilberto has comparative advantage in producing corn, and Juanita has comparative advantage in producing rye. So this is basically what the PPF should look like. We are dealing with a straight line, constant marginal cost trade-off between these two. So if Gilberto spends half his time on each, he gets 50 plus 100 of rye, and that's not changing, right? It's not the more realistic bowed out one, where some of his land is really good for rye and some is really good for corn. And if he decides to start cutting back on rye initially, he gets a lot more corn because he takes land that should have been growing corn anyways and moves it to corn. But by the end, to get a little bit more corn, he has to use his prime rye land, and as a result gets very little extra corn despite giving up a lot of rye. That's more realistic. Here we're dealing with this. Let me see. All right, well, I'm just going to keep at this until I get a message telling me that my student is back. Are you there? Is it Kenya? Not yet. All right. So let's take a look at the rest of the question. Now, absolute advantage is something the textbook's going to talk about. I try to emphasize, actually, let me expand my picture a little bit so you can see that better. Absolute advantage absolutely doesn't matter. It's a thing that you can learn. You can find out what is absolute advantage. And in this case, Juanita has absolute advantage in rye and corn. She is able to produce more of both. But if she wanted more of either one, she would have to give up the other one. So the question is, if she decides to, say, get more corn, so let's say she's starting here, she's spending using half her land on either good, and next year she thinks, you know, I want more corn. Maybe what I should do is produce more corn and give up on some rye, moving from point A to point B. And then the question is, in order to do that, is that really the best way to do things? Let me do this a slightly different way, just to make it a little bit clearer. I should have drawn this in a better spot. So let's say, let's see, I'll use my phone as a ruler here. So let's say instead of A to B, it's just she wants this much more corn. All right, so let's call that plus C. She wants that additional corn. That is going to come at some cost of less rye if she doesn't consider the possibility of trading with Gilberto. So more corn means less rye, and that's fine, right? Sometimes we face trade-offs. But the real question here is, let's call this RJ. This is how much she would give up. Coming back out of focus. Come on, camera, stick with me. Now, hopefully this is enough to figure it out. If it is kind of blurry, I apologize. Over here, we're going to, there we go, that's better. We're going to have RG. So how much rye does Gilberto give up to produce an extra amount of corn? So if Gilberto sells this corn to Juanita, if he is getting, let's call it price is, as long as it's greater than RG, but less than RJ, for this amount of corn, we'll call it PC just to make it clear. So if Gilberto sells corn to Juanita, if she pays him enough to overcome his opportunity cost, he's going to be happy. If she pays lower than her opportunity cost, she's going to be happy also. So to the extent we have a difference in the opportunity cost of getting some corn between what Juanita would have to give up to get that amount of corn or what Gilberto would have to give up to get the same amount of corn, if there is a difference, someone has comparative advantage. Now in this case, we can see RG is definitely lower. Let's do a little bit more mess on this graph just to drive the point home. So now let's use a different color, and we'll say 4 plus R for some amount of rye. Maybe this is 80 units of rye, maybe it's 1 unit of rye. We don't have to worry so much about the numbers, but since these are two parallel lines crossing both of their PPFs, we can see that for Gilberto, he's going to have to give up some corn, right? So if he wants more rye, he's going to lose some corn, and that amount we could call minus CG for cost of corn for Gilberto. And for Juanita, she would also be giving up some amount of corn for that same amount of rye. So her cost would be minus CJ. And we can see that CJ is lower than CG. Right? Like I said, this might be out of scale, so let's not trust my messy paper. Let's go ahead and flip over to here, and let's try and plug in our numbers. So our maximum possible production. Let me get rid of the camera really quickly. So our maximum possible production, our countries are now Juanita and Gilberto, and they are producing rye and corn. And Juanita's maximum production of rye is 400 units. Her maximum corn is 160. For Gilberto, it is 200 and 100. And we've got these trade-offs automatically being calculated, right? We're seeing that for Juanita, her cost of 400 corn is 400 rye is 160 corn. If she makes a lot of rye, she gives up the possibility to make a lot of corn. Her cost per unit is a lot of corn divided by those 400 units of rye, which converts into 0.4 units of corn per unit of rye. One rye costs her not quite a half a bushel of corn. One bushel of corn costs her about 2.5 bushels of rye. And then we've got our comparative advantage here. It's a relatively simple thing. We're just asking, is this cost lower than this cost? If that's the case, let's put a 1 in here. And we've set this up so that we're lining up comparative advantage for rye for Juanita. And the basic nature of fractions is such that if Juanita has comparative advantage in rye, Gilberto must have comparative advantage in corn. There is simply no way around it. The only way that we get rid of that comparative advantage is if they both have the same trade-offs, then no one has comparative advantage. So let's stick with those numbers we've got and take a look at our problem again. Gilberto's opportunity cost of producing 1 bushel of corn. Let's just look per acre. If he uses 1 acre to produce corn, that means he doesn't have that 1 acre available to produce rye, which means he could get 5 corn, but it comes at the cost of 10 rye, which means 1 corn is going to be 1/5 of that amount, which is 1/5 of 10, which is 2. So Gilberto's cost of corn is 2 bushels of rye. His opportunity cost is different than Juanita, meaning that someone has comparative advantage in one and someone has comparative advantage in the other. In this case, Juanita in rye, Gilberto in corn. And then let's think about a possible trade. So here I've just got 20 rye for 30 corn. And we can see Gilberto's happy with that. He is getting a lot of corn. But Juanita, the amount of corn she's giving up just isn't worth the amount of rye she's getting in exchange. For her, she's giving up corn, but each unit of corn is worth 2.5 units of rye that she could have been producing, right? That's her next best alternative to trade, is just make more rye on her own. So let's see, 2.5 times 30 would be, well, 60 is going to be, oh, hey, 60 is close. 60, 75. There we go. 75, Juanita's breaking even. So she gets, what does she get? She's giving up 30 units of corn. So she's giving up a few acres worth of corn, and those few acres could produce a ton of rye. So unless she's getting paid enough rye, she's not happy. If we give her 76, that's enough that she is getting more than she could produce on her own. But in this case, Gilberto is not very happy. Now, the reason that we have this outcome is because we have Gilberto trying to sell rye when his comparative advantage is corn. Right? This would be like trying to get Americans to produce a lot of clothing. That's going to mean fewer Americans working to make gas turbines or high-tech equipment or designing things or setting up difficult and complicated legal arrangements. The things that Americans have comparative advantage in, we would be losing those things in order to get some clothing that someone else has a lower opportunity cost for. So let's change this to, let's just change the direction. So just flipping the direction, we still have the numbers not quite right. We don't have a mutually beneficial trade yet. So let's just fiddle around with this. Let's try 60 Cool. So, and actually, you know what? A really easy way to start this is, let's say 400 compared to 100. Or say 400 compared to 160. So if we say Juanita trades 1 day's work for 1 day's work, she is using all of her productivity to produce rye, and she is saving the equivalent of all of her productivity. She could have just made 160 units of corn and not bothered with the trade. So her outcome is indifferent, right? Not a happy face, not a frowny face. But Gilberto's happy because we are trading in the direction of comparative advantage. So if we just sweeten the deal a little bit for Juanita, now she is going to be coming out ahead. She's getting a full day's productivity of corn from Gilberto, and in order to do it, all she has to do is 99.75% of a year's productivity. So she's going to get 1 bushel of rye basically for free out of this whole arrangement. She's going to walk away with a whole year's worth of corn plus a little bit of extra rye. Gilberto is spending a year and a half to produce all this, so we're not going to be able to make this trade every year. He's going to have to save up. But what he's getting in exchange would have taken him even longer, so Gilberto's coming ahead on this trade. Let's go ahead and put this in terms of Gilberto's PPF. If Juanita gives 200 and he gives 100, he's breaking even. He is spending a year, he's spending all his resources on corn, and he's getting in exchange as much as he could if he had spent all of his resources on producing rye. If we sweeten the deal, we give him a little bit more rye. Oop, we sweetened it too much. We made it so that now Juanita is breaking even. She's spending 62% of her resources to save 62%. So let's call it 225. At 225, we've split the difference. Now they're both happy with this trade. So again, really what this boils down to is we want to figure out what is the trade-off. And the easy way to think through that is to realize Juanita, she could get 400, she could get 160 corn. If she gets 400 rye, she gave up 160 corn. So if she gets 1 rye, she is facing 1/400th of that cost. 160 divided by 400 is what we've got here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop this question now, check in on that student, and let her know that I got to take my dog for a walk. Hopefully this has been another helpful little bit of comparative advantage. Let me just really quickly make this point, though, as long as it's in front of us. So Juanita can produce more rye. She can produce more corn. She has more productivity overall. But the question isn't who's bigger, who's a better farmer. The question is, if we want some more rye, should we ask Juanita to make it for us, or should we ask Gilberto to make it for us? In this case, the answer is Juanita. What that means is that we want her to focus more on making rye and less on making corn, because she has this trade-off. She has to move across her PPF, and we want her to move in the direction of rye. Let's go ahead and bring the camera back. We want Juanita to be moving down in this direction towards her comparative advantage, and we want Gilberto moving in this direction towards his comparative advantage, so that when we are asking for more corn, we're getting it from Juanita because she gives up a lot. Is that right? Yeah, we get our corn, from Gilberto. If we were to ask for our corn from Juanita, we would be sacrificing a lot more rye. Right? So if we want some more rye, we want this much more rye. Juanita gives up a small amount, Gilberto gives up a larger amount. If we split that difference, we can find a way to make it worth both their time. And the result in that case would be, let's go ahead and draw this. If we got a bigger marker, just to make this a little bit more visible. So if Juanita starts here and Gilberto starts here, instead of at something like point A where she's splitting her time 50-50, and then if she wants to get more corn from Gilberto, she's going to be giving up some rye. but he's going to be able to he's going to be able to pay her with more corn so that she's able to move outside of her PPF. And for the same sort of a trade, Gilberto's giving up this amount of corn. That looks about right. For this amount of rye, again, not very well to scale, but the result is Gilberto is able to consume more than it would be possible for him to do without trade. Juanita is also able to consume more than it would be possible to without trade. They're both able to move outside their PPF. This is really the only free lunch in economics. Just by, we're not getting better. All we're doing is we're buying from the person with a lower opportunity cost, and the result is we are able to get more, right? Regardless of the fact that Juanita is more productive, she has absolute advantage. What really counts is she has comparative advantage in rye, and Gilberto necessarily has comparative advantage in corn. I will make one more point because I'm still not hearing from that student. Is that right? Where'd this go? Oh, I think she's disappeared. Maybe I'm answering her question. Let me really quickly check on the stream. Let's see if we've got any chat here. No? All right. Well, hopefully I've answered your question. But in any case, let's come back to here. What was the point I was about to make? Oh, I lost it. It was good too. It was going to be a really good point. It's going to be the best point, but I forgot what it was. Comparative advantage, absolute advantage. Talked about that. Gains from trade. All right, I guess I'll end there. Cool, so I'm going to go take my dog for her afternoon treat.